seriously, I do think that there's a national security implication. I think there are lives at stake. And if I could just take a story, every time there was a terrorist attack, Paris, San Bernardino, France, Paris, even the Syrian war, we would, as investigators, we would get together the day after the attack, and we would ponder amongst ourselves, how much Minnesota taxpayer dollars was being used to fund that war, that attack? What bought that gun? Where'd that money come from? My name is Scott Stillman. I worked for the Department of Human Services. I started working there in 2007, became the manager of the Digital Forensics Lab in 2010. My job there was to investigate primarily employee misconduct, especially as it resolved to digital technology, computers, cell phones, servers, emails. As the daycare program grew, my duties expanded, and I was assigned to go out with law enforcement officers, both FBI, Health and Human Services, BCA, local law enforcement, and a team of investigators embedded within DHS to execute search warrants at some of the businesses that were allegedly committing some fraud. So my job was on the front lines. I would go with the police. They'd execute a lawful search warrant. My job was to identify the computers, the servers, and collect them, extract the data from them, to do some analysis, but then I would give the deeper data that I took from the computers to a team of people in the Office of Inspector General, which is embedded at DHS. Those people, there's a team of those people. Most of those are highly skilled, highly trained. Their expertise consists of terrorism, money laundering, bank fraud, social media investigations. A lot of them are retired law enforcement with highly respected careers. We worked as a team to analyze this data. I got to this point. I was a deputy sheriff with the Washington County Sheriff's Department. I was a detective. My job was to investigate computer crimes, and they sent me to a lot of federal training. I've been trained at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, as have some of my colleagues, and my skill set is highly specialized in this area. If I could mention some of the things that I've worked on, they were daycare frauds based out of Department of Human Services, and they were significant. They were overwhelming. The dollar amounts were upwards of 15 million. I was overwhelmed with the data that I was receiving. I was overwhelmed with what I was seeing on the computers and on their cell phones. I tracked individuals overseas using their phone to compounds in the desert, in countries that are not friendly to the United States, where they would spend months over there while they were operating their DHS daycare business. And then my job was to determine if they were communicating while they were overseas and provide that information. And that's how Fawzia Ali's case went. I found the emails that she sent from Kenya to Hennepin County while she was billing for daycare that she wasn't even present for. My other duties include Medicaid fraud, specifically in the personal care attendant fraud. The dollar amounts and the scope, the size of that far outweigh daycare. I've heard it said that daycare fraud is 100 million. I've heard investigators at DHS tell me, well, I've heard the news media say it's 50% fraud rate. I've had investigators tell me it's closer to 70-80% fraud rate. And those investigators are prohibited from disclosing the data to you that they have because of data privacy laws. They go to work every day and they agonize over what they see on those computers, what they do, what they see in the bank search warrants that they run, where that money goes, where it comes from. Some of those banks, some of those when they were doing the banks, when they were floating money through the banks, it would be deposited at 3 in the morning, and the owner of the account would quickly transfer it from one account to the next, second after second, and go through 50 different bank accounts, which is a form of money laundering. The data we were seeing on the phones was especially alarming. Wire transfers, pictures in foreign countries. I was concerned. I was deeply concerned. And not only because of what I saw, but because of what law enforcement was telling me. I worked very closely with I was a law enforcement officer. I had a lot of friends in law enforcement. And we worked together everywhere from Health and Human Services to FBI to local law enforcement to county sheriffs to state police. We all worked as a team. And some of the things they were telling me and some of the investigations they were working on, I had a hard time sleeping at night. And I would encourage you, talk to some of those people. They'll talk to you. You may have to do it privately, off the record. But what they would reveal to you is, I think it has a national security implication. I really do. And so do they. I worked on a lot of Medicaid fraud, and that the dollar amount of fraud, Medicaid fraud, particularly in personal care attendant fraud, way exceeds the daycare fraud. But most of that money is going to extravagant lifestyles, drugs, large houses, things of that nature. But there's no controls. Or I should say the controls are inadequate. They're not enforced. There's few checks and balances. When we did the Lillian Richardson case, that was in the news. She was on probation in Arkansas for a felony Medicaid fraud conviction. And she was running 50 different shell companies. By shell company, I mean a fraudulent, non-existent company up here in Minnesota, using her family members to extort, to use fraudulent means to extract money from the DHS Medicaid program. And that's in the newspaper. You can look at that. When we stopped counting the loss, it was 18 million. I know it was higher than that. A week after she was released from jail, I was told she was up and running again and started the same businesses and was collecting money from DHS because the controls, the checks and balances, prevented them from shutting her down again. Barb Curran, look in the news. She's in Shakopee prison. She ran a $5 million organized crime ring from her prison cell using a state computer. I asked the state agency if I could have that computer so I could track the money, and they would not give me that computer. There was a way to find that money to get that $5 million back, but we never got that money back because we don't know where it went. Was it possible to find out? Absolutely, but I was prevented. Barb Curran is in the newspaper, and you can check that out. There's some other programs at DHS as well that I know of where they teach people to train immigrants, where they teach them how to find a job. And most of those, the one recently that was in Hennepin County Court for a trial just a few months ago, he used the money to have a harem of females. He had 12 females, and that's how his lifestyle was. That's how he used the money he received for that program. Not all of it, but a good substantial part of it. The internal controls on these programs really need to be examined. I think, and I really appreciate you having me here today to talk about this, because I think, seriously, I do think that there's a national security implication. I think there are lives at stake. And if I could just take a story, every time there was a terrorist attack, Paris, San Bernardino, France, Paris, even the Syrian war, we would, as investigators, we would get together the day after the attack, and we would ponder amongst ourselves, how much Minnesota taxpayer dollars was being used to fund that war, that attack? What bought that gun? Where'd that money come from? Someone should be tracking that. And I think some federal agencies are doing that, But there are some impediments to that you should know about. There are some restrictions to that. I think if you had to ask me for a suggestion on this, and I've been at DHS for 10 years, and I'm no longer there. When I wrote that email, that was the death knell for me, and I had to resign. But when I was there, I saw the internal controls. I saw the Office of Inspector General, which was run and operated by DHS. And I saw the controls, or lack of controls, the checks and balances for these programs. And I liken it to a police officer who commits a crime and then turns around and tells us, well, I'll investigate myself and tell you what I find. If you really want to have objectivity and independence and accuracy and full disclosure and transparency, you really might want to consider taking the investigative component away from the entity that controls and manages it and make them independent. I can't emphasize that strongly enough, that you are not being told everything. There are things out there. When Fox 9 pulled out my emails, where I think there were 12 emails, complete pages were redacted. And what was redacted were my case statistics. I was required to keep track of how many cases I was running every month, the dollar amount of the fraud, whether it was organized crime. And believe me, Minnesota's government programs are being victimized by organized crime because of lack of controls. And I could show you example after example after example, mostly because of lack of controls. But that's what was redacted from my emails. And if I could say one more thing, the data privacy laws in place prevented me from coming forward. It prevents my coworkers who have just as many concerns as I have from coming forward. The whistleblower laws that the states control severely restrict me from coming forward and saying what I know, and prevent them from coming as well. The data privacy laws are they're ripe for corruption in the state of Minnesota. I on Fox 9's news report, and I have to give a congratulations to Fox 9, because they had the courage to come forward and say this. And there were a lot of things that they discovered that they didn't put in their news report. And I would encourage you to talk to the reporter, because there are things in there that they just didn't think they could quite put out there, things that would probably really concern you. If I said in my Fox 9 investigation, in my interview, that I would like to request a federal investigation of how these programs are being run and managed at DHS. And I said that for a reason, and I spoke to Senator Abler about that. But I think it needs to be objective and somebody who is not controlled by someone in the state, not necessarily you, but other individuals who might have an influence on that and on that investigation. And I think the entity to do that would be the Health and Human Services at the federal level. I'm just going to close with saying one thing. This is not a Minnesota problem. It started in Minnesota, but we found an individual in our investigation who was teaching and training other states to do this, and it's spreading out. It's in Seattle, New Jersey, New York, Florida, Georgia. It's everywhere. And so I appreciate the time that you provided me to be here today.
Thank you, Mr. Tillman. Actually, we chatted, and we had a very good discussion, you and I. And so, keeping my own rule of not doing questions, I just going to ask you to elaborate on some of the things we spoke about that didn't come out in your conversation. So you talked about, 4 main areas where you saw concerns: the child care thing, which made the news; the PCA program, which you said it was some 5 times as much; this training program; and then the lack of internal controls. Could you just comment a little bit about so you gave us some examples of success stories where people have gone to jail, but there's some gaps that you saw. Like, could you just offer a little thought about, in the child care program, what gaps are not being addressed in the oversight by DHS?
Besides the lack of controls, unannounced on-site inspections, background checks, cameras on site, things of that nature, the restitution levels on those cases are, I would encourage you to look closely. I would say that I was informed that the DECO investigation, which is in the newspaper, so I think they obtained $4 million conviction with restitution on that. When that case started, I was informed by investigators it was actually $40 million in fraud. But because of statute of limitations and policies in place, not all of that money could be prosecuted and therefore collected. So I would say if there's indications that restitution is taking place, I would verify that.
Thank you. And so let me ask the second part. And so just the last thing I think I'll have you talk about, you mentioned PCAs. Can you mention some ways that are not being investigated where people commit fraud that you think the department should be doing? Please.
The PCA fraud and Medicaid fraud is rampant. The controls in place are inadequate. I've been on search warrants where you'll have employees, the police will have the employees there, and the phone will be ringing, and nurses will be calling in and saying, I'm calling because I just was reported that you reported that I worked for you, you have my name, my date of birth, and you're telling the IRS I work for you, but I've never worked for you. So those are shell companies for the most part. A lot of that money is being diverted to sources that are not helping the real needy Minnesotans. And I think there should be an independent audit of the controls, the laws, the regulations, the checks and balances, things of that nature.
Well, thank you. And I'm not sure if I don't want you to name any names, but just I want you to say it, not me, because we were talking about that. And would you say that, we talked about this, so you had mentioned that there were some examples of undue influence by some people in high positions that were influencing some of the outcomes of some of these investigations. Do you want to comment about that? No names.
That's why I asked for an independent federal investigation. A federal investigation would reveal that there are other entities involved in this who may be receiving benefits from this fraud. And I want to be really careful what I say here because...
Well, that's fine. I just wanted to broach that topic as well.
Okay.
So this has been, and so it's very sensitive. And anyway, Mr. Stillman, thank you.
Thank you.
So you're excused.
Thank you.